Yeah, well, so let me just directly start. Nico has already introduced me. Ronja is also here, so she's also going to help me answering your questions afterwards. What we wanted to present to you today is our project called Who Are They Talking To? Detecting Mentions of Social Groups in Political Text using Supervised Machine Learning. And let me directly start with the motivation of this project. So generally speaking, politics is really about representing the values and interests of different societal groups. And from research, we already know quite a bit about differences between groups' political opinions, their behaviors, and also their identities. And this is also the realm where we know most about like substantive and descriptive representation. But the motivation for this project comes from, let's say maybe a more recent strand of literature that focuses on how politicians talk about social groups, right? So we generally know, or from our day-to-day experience, we know that politicians talk about social groups for maybe many various reasons, right? So they may talk about social groups to mobilize them, to signal responsiveness to their interests, also to just make them feel represented. And also on the negative sides of things, they might talk about social groups just to attribute blame, right? Scapegoating mechanisms, stuff like that. So we were really curious about these kind of group-related phenomena in political speech. So we delved into the literature, and what we found is basically that there is quite some bit on the role of societal groups in political rhetoric. So for one, we know a little bit about how group-based rhetoric can affect people's political preferences and behaviors. And this kind of evidence comes mostly from experimental research. But then we also, and that's the strand of literature I've just mentioned, new kind of research focuses also on how politicians and more parties actually use group-based rhetoric in their public communication, right? To just like meet these kind of goals or attain these kind of goals I've just mentioned. But what we argue in our paper is that that's all fine, but one thing we really always need to do before we can actually study quantitatively how politicians talk about groups is identify where they talk about groups, right? About which groups they talk when they write text or when they deliver speeches, right? And we know, and I mean, do not actually have to mention that here, we can do that with Texas data approaches. But what we argue in our paper is basically that in order to move that field that focuses on how politicians and parties use group-based rhetoric, to move that field forward, we actually need more automated procedures to detect where politicians and parties talk about groups in their texts and speeches. What we then, of course, contribute is a novel supervised learning approach for detecting group mentions in political texts. And this approach basically has three features, if you want. So the first one is that we rely, of course, it's supervised learning. So we rely on, in the first step, on human coding, which provides us with valid measures as an input to our machine learning procedure. And then we rely on supervised learning. So we use those human annotations to train a reliable machine learning classifier that can actually then be scaled to large text corpora, right? Which provides us with this automation we need in order to tackle more, work with bigger data, if you want so. And the specific highlight of our procedure, because most of you might know that supervised learning strategies, applying them to text data is not actually something new in the literature, right? I mean, we have seen papers about support vector machines, for example, since already the 2000s, like around 2004, if you maybe, And what we do here is now apply classification strategies that rely on deep learning in order to provide contextualized token level classification, which allows us to really identify the exact spans of texts that contain mentions of social groups. And that's the most, like from a methodological perspective, we would argue that's the most important innovation we contribute. And what we then do in our paper, and what I'm also going to talk about in a minute, is a case study where we kind of showcase our new approach, where we apply it to study how mainstream parties in Britain have used group-based campaigning communication in their campaign rhetoric. Right. So this is just a very kind of brief summary of what we focus on and what we contribute. So now let me step into a short note on what group mentions actually look like in the wild, because we think to kind of contextualize our work, it's kind of important to give you an impression of what these kind of mentions look like in actual political texts. So here we have some examples where, for example, I can just read out the first one, where I think it was from the Labour Party. They say, we seek to bring about fundamental change in the balance of power and wealth in favor of working people and their families. And we have just highlighted here those two mentions of the working people as one group, and then the other one of their families. And these are two group mentions that occur in this political text. And then there's also a couple of more of these examples. And we have made basically two observations when studying these texts based on our qualitative reading. The first one is that more often than not, these kind of group mentions are multi-word expressions, right? So there can be 2 words, there can be 3 words, but there can also be 14 words sometimes. And I'm showing you some example later on. The other observation we have made, and I think we are probably, like, if you ask qualitative scholars or also discourse analysts, we're probably not the first one to note that. But what we observed is that there can be group mentions that are relatively specific about which groups are actually addressed or talked about. But then there can also be more or less abstract mentions, such as the wretched of the world or the deprived, that in a way evoke an idea about a social group that's not so closely tied to immediately observable social demographic characteristics. So there's a whole spectrum of different kinds of ways of how politicians can actually evoke the idea of a social group that might exist in the heads of readers or listeners. Then the third and fourth and fifth, apparently, observation we have made is that in addition to those clear references to social groups that are based on observable social demographic characteristics, group mentions can also be descriptive, right? So the first example we have here, people who live and work in rural areas. It's basically constructing the social group that's in a way intersectional, right? So they live in rural areas, but they're also working people. So it's basically a co-occurrence of these attributes that specifies which group exactly is meant. And then one thing I've also mentioned already is that these kind of mentions can span several words. So the most extreme one is the last example, those who've dedicated their lives to the service of the community, right? This is a whole very descriptive reference to a social group. Again, not really a clearly circumscribed social group, but it's just rather invoked by mentioning what common characteristics these people share, in a sense. And all these examples, I'm just bringing them up here to give you some idea of, like, the versatility and the diversity of the multiple ways in how social groups can be mentioned in political text and speech. So this was the starting point of our project. Now the question is, what can we actually do to quantify them, right? How can we kind of detect them in political texts in order to study them more closely? Because again, our argument is, in order to study how politicians talk about social groups, we first need to identify where they mention social groups. What can we do with existing methods, right? Because, like, the existing work is always kind of the benchmark you have to, like, address. The first thing, all research so far, at least to the best of our reading or our understanding, they have relied on manual content analysis. So they've just done what I've shown you on the previous slide, right? They just go through the text, they read it, and then the human coders that read the text just detect the specific mentions and maybe also already categorize them into specific bins, say working people, old people, young people, or what have you, right? Different papers apply different categorization schemes, but this is the classical manual content analysis process, right? What do we think this approach, or like this manual content analysis approach, speaks in favor of it? First, most would argue, and I think there's a lot of evidence for that, like manual content analysis, generally speaking, has high validity. And also, great feature of that approach is that you can actually, while reading the text, already categorize these mentions into specific groups, right? So again, working people, young people, and so on. And also, what I've shown you on the previous slide is that we have those kind of specific and more abstract group references. And we would argue, and also others have relied on that in their work, that human coders can actually detect both these kind of ways how groups can be mentioned in texts. And this is a great advantage, we think. On the other hand, it's very well known, and that generally is a point that can be said about content analysis if you apply manual techniques, is that it's very resource intensive and hence time consuming, right? So if you focus on the literature we've cited here, maybe you're familiar with one or the other paper of them, most of them focus like on the single country in a very specific period of time, or just a few parties. And we believe, and also we've talked to those folks, of course, most of the time that's due to like the resource constraints you face if you want to kind of engage in this manual content analysis procedure. So all that means that the manual content analysis approach is just generally speaking, but also in this specific application, not scalable to large amounts of data, which limits the kind of research questions we can really ask. Then on the other hand, I think the most clear go-to solution to that scalability problem usually is constructing dictionaries, right? So you just compile a list of kinds of ways in how groups can be mentioned in political texts, and then apply the dictionary to the target corpus, either to kind of like quantify the prevalence of mentions in the text or the prevalence of mentions of specific groups in the text, or maybe like really identify the locations where they are mentioned. So that, for example, you can look at the words in the context in order to study qualitatively or maybe even quantitatively how they talk about the social groups. What's great about that, of course, you can automate the measurement procedure, right? You just have to come up with those predefined words that map to the pre-specified categories of groups you have in mind. So no manual annotation needed. But we think the great problem about this is selecting the keywords a priori, right? Because I've just shown you those examples where the kind of ways how politicians can refer to social groups can be manifold. And we just believe, and we are also currently working on like showing this with evidence, that can be incredibly hard. And if you add to this the kind of elite biases we have in our minds, if, for example, you want to apply this method to like citizens produce texts, then you struggle really with identifying all the different ways in how groups can be mentioned or invoked in political rhetoric. So I think these are like this is kind of the tension between the manual approach and the dictionary approach. So what we propose to do instead is apply supervised learning. I've already mentioned this. We are not the first to do that in the context of political text analysis. But what we add is kind of this token level or word level focus, if you want so, in the supervised learning procedure. So our approach has 3 steps. The first step would be to collect human annotations from coders that basically just highlight in a text where groups are mentioned. And then you train a supervised classifier that predicts which words in a sentence belong to a group mention, right? By using those human annotations, you can kind of like train the classifier to recognize this in hello texts. And because you can do that out of sample, you can apply this classifier to basically predict the occurrences of group mentions in all unlabeled texts in your entire corpus. And this provides you with the scalability that's so crucial to study big data, or like to work with big data. We think the strength of our approach, and I'm talking about the specifics in the next slides, is that we go inductive about the task. I talked about the dictionaries. We just think that recognizing when a group is mentioned in a text is just way easier than to recall all the different ways of how it could be mentioned, right? Compiling this dictionary. We think recognition is just easier. Then also we focus on one task at a time. We first focus on retrieval or recognition, and then later on we can deal with like organizing or categorizing the different groups. And then also we boost scalability by combining the validity advantage of human coding with the scalability advantage of machine learning. Okay, because this is very abstract, I think this is just a very brief description of what we propose. Let me focus on our application now. I'm just going to drink some water. What we've done is basically study a case that has already been studied by others. It's the context of mainstream party competition in the UK. So we focus on the election manifestos of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party in the elections between 1965 and 2015. And we've just extracted all the text from the manifestos, split them into sentences, and then basically removed everything else that wasn't of interest, such as quotes or images or headings, right? So we have a very clean corpus so that we can attribute all the kind of errors in the measurement procedure to the data, to the method, not to the data quality. The first step, as I mentioned, is human annotation. We have focused in this application on mentions of social groups, which just for purpose of a working definition, we have defined as collectives of people with common characteristics that are not formally organized. For example, in contrast to interest groups, protest movements, political groups such as parties, right? They are all formally or more or less organized. So we're focusing just on those social groups such as families, workers, and so on. And we also have additional categories I don't want to talk about in detail here because of time. But this is just our focus. And again, some examples, working people, their families, but also those long descriptive references such as people who live and work in rural areas. I think someone has their audio. The way we approach this from a practical point of view is just providing our coders with an annotation tool that allows them to just highlight as in a PDF editor, if you want, so where these groups are mentioned, so right, they can just highlight them, and this provides us with the label data we can use for machine learning. And what we've done is we've hired 2 research assistants and extensively trained them, and for the first step of this project, we now already have more data than that, 4,770 manifesto sentences, part of them like annotated by both annotators and some of them just annotated by one annotator. And as you can see, the intercoder reliability for this kind of task is quite high. So if we focus on all sentences, so also including sentences where none of the coders has highlighted any part as a reference to a social group, we have an average Krippendorff's alpha value of 0.9 in the first round and also 0.93 in the second round of coding. And then if we just focus on all those sentences that have at least one social group annotation, we are a little bit lower. This is because like all those sentences without any coding, there's always perfect agreement, right? So they inflate kind of the reliability estimate. But they are still, we are above this like 0.65 threshold that's usually applied to Krippendorff's alpha. I've also some metrics on where there is rather high disagreement between annotators, and our error analysis suggests or shows that most of the disagreement also has to do with kind of disagreement where the specific highlight begins and where the specific highlight, so the kind of group mention, ends in a sentence. So not all of the disagreement comes from substantive disagreement, this kind of complete disagreement, whether or not this should be a social group mention, right? But rather something like maybe one of the annotators says the before working class should be included, and the other one says, no, it should only be working class. This would be counted as a disagreement, but in our opinion, it's not very substantive. Coming to the supervised learning step, what we've then done is a classical setup. We just set aside 500 of those sentences for validation, 500 for testing, and use the remaining almost 4,000 sentences for fine-tuning of a Roberta base model, which is just a transformer-based language model. And we have applied this kind of token classification strategy that allows us to predict words, labels in sentence context, right? And how does that task look like? Because I think beyond the application of pre-trained named entity recognizers, I haven't seen that in political science, so I just wanted to talk briefly about it. What token level classification basically means is that each word in a sentence has a specific label, right? Usually we have one sentence level label. And here we have one label per word or token, depends on how you see it or how you name it. But in this case, for example, the first word would be labeled or highlighted or annotated as a mention of a political group. So its label would be beginning of a political group, mention. Then the next two words don't have an annotation, and then working people would again be categorized as social group, right? And these are the kind of labels we learn to predict while accounting for the sentence context. And this contextualization comes from the attention mechanism that's built into this transformer model. If we evaluate this classifier in the test set, what we find is that just at the word level, our F1 score is like 0.75, which basically means that about like 8 out of 10 words belonging to an actual social group mention recorded in the test set is actually correctly detected. This was the recall, right? And the precision would just mean it's at around like 0.7, would just mean that when predicting that a word belongs to social group mention, the classifier errs, so makes a mistake in about 3 out of 10 times, which is like considering typical F1 score values you see in published political science literature quite okay-ish, we would argue. But then we've taken a closer look at what are the sources of those errors and moved up from the word to the span level, right? The span is always an entire mention of a social group. And what we found there is that actually if you go up to the span level, which is the unit of measurement we are essentially most interested in, we even obtain or achieve a recall for those social group category of 0.9 and a precision of 0.81. So our point is basically that if you really just focus on how much of those mentions you get on average in a correct, we are performing even better. And the reason why our recall, for example, is not perfect, again, this kind of error analysis has to do with the fact that sometimes we just miss the beginning of the span. So the classifier just misses the correct beginning of the span or terminates too prematurely, right? So maybe misses the last word in a span. But mostly those are captured quite well. And then one thing we also wanted to include in our analysis when we report results is the sentence level performance, because usually in political science, we have sentence level supervised classification, and there they report the F1 scores we can directly compare. And here we have an F1 score of 0.943, which is, I think, quite, yeah, it's almost perfect. And I think this is very reassuring, given that we only have used part of the data we have already collected. So yeah, this is quite reassuring. And one footnote, we think that even if you don't buy into this span level annotation approach we propose, you can apply this token classification to obtain a sentence level classifier that allows you, for example, to pre-filter sentences, which you could then fully annotate by human coders, right? So even if you don't think we should fully automate this, what we show is that you can actually automate at least part of the way of that measurement procedure. Let me come to the analysis. What we've then done is use that classifier and applied it to all sentences in our corpus of British party manifestos, or British mainstream party manifestos, and just for the moment, show some descriptives. The first descriptive I'm showing you is basically the prevalence of mentions of social groups, so the share of sentences that contain at least one social group mention, and how that has changed for the two parties over time. And what we can see is that especially for the Labour Party, which is depicted here in orange, the orange line, has steadily more or less increased over time, whereas for the Conservative Party has already been quite high and higher than that for the Labour Party in the 1970s, then has moved in parallel, but then has like, I think maybe Ronja can correct me later on. I think this was when, I forgot this. I should have taken a note. Like this was a change in leadership and then it dipped down for the Conservative Party. I have to figure it out. This is the first thing. And we find this trend is quite similar to what Mats Tau has shown in his pioneering work. So we think this is some evidence of some degree of face validity as a first result. And then also what we've done is some explorative analysis of what these group mentions are actually talking about for the two parties. And we've just applied this classical fighting words analysis. Like this is a paper from 2008 by Bert Monroe and others, where they just propose a Bayesian method for kind of figuring out which words in the language use of two different groups are most distinctive if you just compare the groups. And we just apply this method here to the entire corpus, focusing on the social group mentions. And in this way, we can kind of filter out the words that are most distinctive for either party, right? And then for the Conservative Party, which is depicted again in green here, we find that they talk a lot about white-collar occupations such as fishermen or farmers, also agricultural workers, right? They even explicitly mention quite often taxpayers, which is very distinctive for their group-based rhetoric, and then also societal outgroups such as immigrants and criminals. And on the other hand, Labor, what they focus most on is age-based groups such as young people and old people, specifically mention very frequently the working class, but also poor women, and also very distinctive in their rhetoric is the mention of women. So this is just something, I think, to people who work with these kind of phenomena in their research, like identity politics and generally the study of like who these parties represent in electoral politics should kind of go along with their priors, we would say. But yeah, we can still work on more of the descriptives and also some substantive analysis. Which brings me to the conclusion. So we conclude basically that the growing body of research that studies how parties and also politicians use this kind of group-based rhetoric can actually contribute from a method that enables them to scale the supervised the measurement procedure to large amounts of text, and we propose to do that with supervised learning, and we apply it to the UK party manifestos. And just summarizing our results again, we find high intercoder reliability in this kind of mention detection annotation task. We find that our supervised token level classifier achieves high reliability by training only on less than 4,000 sentences. And as I mentioned, we are collecting more, and we think those results are going to improve. And also, in sum, we basically provide a tool that allows great scalability. And we try to show, or at least give some glimpse into the kind of exciting new analysis people will be able to conduct with the method we are proposing. Outlook, what we want to do next is like focus more strongly or analyze more carefully the potential biases our classifier might have, right? So is it performing very well in mentions of specific social groups? Maybe, for instance, it performs less well in references to societal outgroups just because on average they're mentioned less often, and the classifier is not able to learn their detection as well as for majority population groups. Positive negative mentions could be another bias we want to investigate. But then we also want to focus on generalizability and transferability by kind of studying whether with the classifier trained on the Labour and Conservative Party manifesto texts, whether this classifier can also reliably detect group mentions in, for example, the SNP or Lib Dem manifestos, whether it transfers to different languages. We are currently collecting annotations for German manifestos, and also whether it can transfer to different domains, right? And the whole idea here with the transferability would be that if we can show that we kind of predict out of domain or out of language very well, then we would believe this is evidence of the fact that we can kind of train a general purpose group mention detector for political science. More innovations, what we still need to work on is kind of categorizing or clustering those mentions we extract with our method, right? Because I've mentioned previously, like the strength of content analysis and dictionary measurement is that you can actually assign specific mentions into predefined categories, such as working people or old people, right? And we think we can achieve this with unsupervised or at least like semi-supervised clustering strategies. So we still have to work on that. But we think there is quite a bit of work on in computer science that would allow us to do that. Last but not least, substantive downstream tasks we're currently considering, maybe in another paper. We're not sure whether we should integrate it in this one, but we are thinking about studying how, for example, constituency level economic changes affect MPs, working class appeals. And we also have some research design ideas about how franchise extensions might shape MP's group-based rhetoric, right? For example, broadening it or something like that. That's from my side. Thanks for your attention. I'm really looking forward to your question. And as I said, like Ronja is going to help me out with answering your questions. Contact, yeah, I don't know. Maybe you want to contact us, but I'm open for questions now.